Hello everyone, welcome back to Joe's Philosophy, and today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a collective insight on race. So before we start, I want to make this clear that this is a philosophical culmination, so that means that the following presentation will cover many different philosophical texts, which helps us form rhetoric for ideas of what is race, why is it used, and how do we use it. First, I would like to go over our table of contents, and these are the five philosophical readings that we're going to be going over. The first one is Plato's Republic. It discusses his hierarchy and what he saw in his ideal republic. We're going to have Gotanda, a critique on our Constitution is colorblind. That gives us a historical context of how race is used. We then have Haslanger, gender and race. That gives us a mind frame of how we should think about race. Fourth, we have Descartes' discord on method, really getting down to what is race. And then finally, you have Russell, appearance and reality, and that's really kind of applying those thoughts that we got from the other readings. So why don't we get into our first one? And our first one is Plato's Republic. So first, before we get into anything, I have a picture on the top right that I'd like to explain a little bit. This is a hierarchy. It's kind of looks like how a caste system would look. But at the top, it's a pyramid divided into three pieces. At the top, it's going to be the quote-unquote guardians. These are the philosophers, the rulers, people who are searching for things in the intelligible realm, things that are eternal, knowledge, things like that. In the middle, you can see the yellow portion are the soldiers. They're fighting for honor and glory, which that puts them in the middle of the pyramid. And at the bottom, we have the workers who are, working for money. And Plato created this because he believed that people's search for whatever they are searching for in life is almost how much their life is valued. So, for instance, the workers, they were working for money, so he saw that as sort of a sign of greed, so he put them at the bottom. Soldiers are fighting for glory and honor, and then at the top, of course, the guardians. We know that Plato really valued things in the intelligible realm, so those eternal things like math and science and things like that, he really valued those, so those would be at the top of the pyramid. And real quick, this model is based off perspective. Anybody can make their ideal republic, but we got to realize that this kind of set a groundwork for what racism is, and that's because number one, it created subjugated oppression. It separated groups of people from each other and treated them accordingly, and it also justified this oppression based on what values these people expressed and what they wanted in life. So, really, this is just a groundwork. It shows that people can justify racism, and I think that's a lot of times why people are racist and they have racist thoughts. So next, I'd like to get into Gotanda. Look at Gotanda looking like an intellectual man over there. But his text is a critique of our Constitution is colorblind. So he wants to say that our Constitution is not colorblind, even though that it states that you shouldn't treat people of different races differently. But first, to question what race is, we have to look at race at a historical context, which this text does very well. This text verifies and shows how the Constitution itself isn't even colorblind. The Constitution stating that we shouldn't treat others of differing races differently is assuming that inherently America isn't racist and ignores the inequalities which are present in our nation. We have also historically not recognized race as a spectrum. This always frustrated me as a kid, as a biracial person, because the way that we speak about race, it almost gives the idea that white is pure and everything else contaminates it. And that kind of gives us the idea of hypodescent, which is if you have any African blood whatsoever, you're considered African, not what maybe you might be the most of. And finally, thinking like an essentialist with race gives justification that we are all different inherently, thus giving racial connotation. This ties into classical because we understand that people justify racism, and through that justification, it leads to ideas like hypodescent. We saw that in Plato's Republic. This also leads to inequalities and the oppression of people of color face today. This leads me to my case study. This is a case study done by Harvard. It is addressing the racial disparities of the Massachusetts probation system. And I'm going to read this little excerpt, this summary. What does it take to bring about meaningful change that produces good results where racial disparities are concerned? If we aren't institutions to be responsive and equitable, what will it require? This multimedia case study examines the efforts made by the Massachusetts Probation Service since 2013. I looked at this, and there's a lot of disparities with how people, especially in the justice system, are treated. And I thought this tied right in with Gotanda's critique on the Constitution not being colorblind, so we can show that systematically racism is still present. Next, we have Haslanger, gender and race. First, the main idea about this text is the thought of essentialism versus pragmatism. It's two different ways of thinking. I want to give a little introduction to that first. So, essentialists think in a way of people and objects have properties about themselves that are essential to making that person or object. Thinking like this causes people to focus on our differences. It polarizes people of the same human race. This thinking pits people against each other and has caused conflict throughout time. And on the flip side, which in this text Haslanger promotes this thinking, it's thinking pragmatically, it's pragmatism. And it's the doctrine that ideas must be looked at in terms of their practical effects and consequences. This means instead of thinking of our differences, we must interpret these differences and the practical effects of these differences and act accordingly. This enforces that yes, we all have racial differences, but we must formulate the best way to combat these differences. And how we use race. This explains how we use race today. By thinking in different ways, we can change our purpose when it comes to race. And again, this ties into Gotanda and Plato because it shows the type of thinking that led us to Plato's ideal republic. And thinking pragmatically also allows us to identify racism and not act like it's non-existent like sort of the Constitution does. So thinking like this, my goal for this project is everything to relate to each other. So as we go on, I'm going to continue to try to tie that in. But our next one is Descartes, his Discord on Method. Descartes' Discord on Method discusses what makes something exist and what makes them human. Throughout methodological doubt, he decides that it isn't limbs or any physical attribute that makes someone human. Assuming that this is true, people with differing race are all human, and this inherently discredits the ideals behind racism. I feel like that's really important. Next, we have Russell, his appearance and reality. Russell, in his text Appearances and Reality, discusses that appearances differ based on perspective. He believes that only true things in the world resides in the intelligible realm, which math and science exist. And this text talks about perspective and how when you look at things differently, what pops out is differently. And I think we can relate that to racism and what we've been talking about today, because racism is based off stereotypes and perspective. We all have the same chemical makeup, so it isn't justified treating anyone differently. But this relates to the prior texts I've gone over because it is the cause of racism. Individuals having preconceived notions on what people are based on color is all about the perspective of that said individual and them justifying it, like I said earlier. That said, in order to decrease our inequalities, we must think pragmatically, like Haslanger stated and what we talked about just a minute ago. So that's the end. To conclude this presentation, we reviewed 5 philosophical texts that truly help us interpret the meanings of race. We reviewed the texts of Haslanger, Russell, Gotanda, Plato, and Descartes. Hope you guys enjoyed Joe's philosophy. I'll catch you next video. Thank you so much.